Good evening and welcome to the Bridge for Early Career Preachers Bridge Conversation. Tonight we are talking about preaching and neurodiversity. We are really glad that you've joined us. This is the third of four web conversations for 2025. And if you're new to us, the mission of the Bridge for Early Career Preachers is to provide resources, continuing education, and a supportive community for those who are moving from aspiring to active preaching ministries. So for those of you who've joined us tonight, you're in your first several years of preaching. We are here to continue learning with you and to walk with you as you make your way in the work of preaching. No matter where you are in your journey, we're really glad that you have joined us tonight. I'm confident that there's something in tonight's conversation for everyone, and I'm really looking forward to our time together. My name is Rich Voles. I serve as Associate Professor of Preaching and Worship here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. I also serve as the director for the Bridge for Early Career Preachers. As I noted, our conversation for the night is on preaching and neurodiversity. I'll serve as our host, or as our moderator. For those of you who are watching online, if you have comments or questions at any time, please feel free to submit those in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on those in real time. And I'm also going to reserve some time at the end for us to address any questions. So do think about what you might like to ask our panelists as our time comes to an end tonight. We are joined by three amazing guests. I'm really excited for them to share their knowledge, their experiences, and their wisdom about our topic. So please allow me to introduce them briefly. First up, we have Dr. Lamar Hardwick, also known online as the Autism Pastor. He's a pastor, a cancer survivor, PhD student, and award-winning author focused on the intersection of disability, race, and religion. Pastor Hardwick was diagnosed with autism at the age of 36, and he provides workshops and consults with businesses, churches, universities, and faith-based organizations on becoming more disability inclusive. He's a graduate of Candler School of Theology at Emory University, the Clergy Scholar Program at Yale Divinity School, and a 2017 graduate of Georgia Forward's Young Game Changers program. He's authored 4 books, including his most recent one, which is entitled How Ableism Fuels Racism, Dismantling the Hierarchy of Bodies in the Church, and that's through Brazos Press, published in 2024. Welcome, Lamar. We're also really excited to have Avery Arden on tonight with us. Avery is a Louisville Seminary alum residing in Atlanta, Georgia, and their ministry centers around transgender and disability theology and praxis. They currently serve on the National Board of More Light Presbyterians, and Avery is available to preach, to teach, to write for your community, and has an online space with resources around inclusive and expansive liturgy and a disability theology YouTube series. So welcome, Avery. We're glad you're here as well. And finally, last but not least, Reverend Dr. Aaron Rafferty. Aaron is a practical theologian who uses ethnographic methods to study Christian congregations and communities. She's currently a lecturer in the Princeton Writing Program, where she teaches on disability justice, and a senior researcher at Princeton Theological Seminary, where she studies Christian congregations. She's the author of 2 books, first entitled From Inclusion to Justice, published by Baylor in 2022, and Families We Need, published by Rutgers in 2023. She's an ordained teaching elder in the PCUSA and is a proud parent of a daughter with multiple disabilities, as well as a disability advocate. So welcome to all 3 of you. Thanks for saying yes to this conversation. I'm looking forward to learning and growing, as I know are those who are tuning in tonight. So let's dive in, shall we? Our first question is this. And Avery, if you wouldn't mind to answer this one first, that would be great. So neurodiversity is a term that's used a lot more today than it was even 5 years ago. So how do you define neurodiversity, and why is it important that it's part of our vocabulary? Let's kind of set the stage for everybody tuning in tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. And yeah, neurodiversity is a framework. I define it as a framework for understanding the diversity of neurotypes, of how human brains function in a way that moves it out of medical models, or thinking of certain ways of being a human as non-normative or broken. Neurodiversity, um, for me, like, sorry, why it matters, um, from a faith perspective, is, for me, it highlights the fact that our Creator delights in diversity, that we are in the image of an infinite God. And so it makes sense that we come in almost infinite variety, and that includes how our brains work. Understanding it this way is also political, because when we move discussions of any disability, including cognitive disabilities, when we move it away from a medical model and see it as something that has to be cured and treated, we instead move towards the idea that no matter what your neurotype is, you deserve equal rights, right? That we deserve representation and full respect and full access to everything from classrooms to the pulpit. Yeah.
Thank you. That's you've introduced us to a lot of good language already. I'm thinking about, you used the word broken, delight in diversity, that the aspect of how this is a political issue. So thanks for beginning to unravel some of this for us and laying the groundwork. Lamar, how would you expand and add to what Avery's brought to us?
Yeah, thank you for that, Avery. It was such a great definition. I don't know that there's much more that I can add to it, but I would say that for me, in addition to what um, they already shared, is the idea that neurodiversity then also opens up the conversation for celebrating the different neurotypes that are out there, but then also in scholarship taking more seriously the bodies of work that proceed from the minds of those who are considered or have historically and traditionally been considered atypical, taking more seriously the scholarship that proceeds from those minds and adding it um, into the canon of all of the things that we have been writing about as it pertains to diversity and what it means to be human, and a lot of other things that Avery already shared. But I would definitely say the celebration, but then also the appreciation of the scholarship that comes from, and I say scholarship. I'll just say one last thing, not just in terms of those of us who have the privilege to sit in the ivory towers of um, institutions, but scholarship in terms of the on the ground lived experience of those who have a variety of neurotypes who bring a lot to the conversation of what it means to be human.
I appreciate that. So the category of celebration, for those of us who may not have a lot of experience in this conversation, may be something that we wouldn't think of right offhand. So I appreciate the move to get us towards celebration early in our conversation. So thanks for that. Aaron, what would you add here?
Not much, because my colleagues have done a tremendous job, but along with what Lamar shared about really taking seriously the contributions of neurodivergent folks, I think it's always helpful to point out that neurodiversity is a term that emerged out of the autistic people's self-advocacy movement. And so I think some people are like, oh, neurodiversity, like that's such a mouthful. But it really comes from neurodivergent folks themselves in terms of, what they see to be values and contributions and language that they invite us to use. And of course, when it comes to disability, everyone is going to choose the terms that feel most comfortable for them. But I think it's really insightful. Like, this is leadership from neurodivergent folks, right? Teaching us, as my colleagues have said so beautifully, about the contributions, right? And the dignity and the beauty and the celebration that's possible. So I think it's very much an invitation to experience, right, the beauty of the neurodiversity that God has made. And I love that this is autonomy, right? This comes out of the autistic, people self-advocacy movement, and then goes on to be so wildly inclusive, which is like the best thing about the disability community is if you think you're in and you feel that you're in because you experience life in a disabled way, you're in. And so it also, like, I think broadens the boundaries, which I think is kingdom of God stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so acknowledging that word is the word itself, neurodiversity, is an expression from the autistic community, is a way of honoring it and honoring those who use that term themselves. So I appreciate just what I'm learning here and how using that language itself can be an opening act of solidarity. Anything else y'all want to add here? Lamar, Avery, anything else y'all want to sort of add to the conversation?
Sort of taking what Lamar and Aaron said first about this neurodiversity being, well, it's a huge umbrella term that does include neurotypicals, right? I don't know that any of us clarified that, just in case. It's a word that spans all human beings, right? We all belong. No one person is neurodiverse, but we are all under this umbrella. But also talking about that, that it's, centering neurodivergent people, the people who have been, I liked, Lamar, how you described people who have been sort of viewed as atypical in one way or another. And then Aaron, you saying that this is a really inclusive term. I think it's so important to like really hone in on the fact that if you think you fit under the umbrella, you probably do. The neurotypical mind is considered typical as in like the most common, but in the end, like most of us at some point in our lives, even if it's only briefly, if you experience brain fog, if you have depression, you could argue for being under the neurodivergent umbrella. One word that I often prefer to neurotypical is neuronormative, because in the end, saying any one brain type is the most common or least we're talking about how a very unjust system categorizes human beings. If like in the end, I don't know that many of us at all quite fit into what is considered the normal or healthy brain. That doesn't mean that, like, obviously, of course, some of us more than others, just in the sense that that our neurodivergence is sort of in some way blocking our access to various things, etc. But just understanding that even the neuronormative brain is in many ways a construct, if that makes sense. I don't know if I articulated that well, if anyone wants to fix my wording on that.
I think that was really helpful and really well said. So thank you for that expansion. Lamar, anything you want to add here?
No, I mean, why mess up a good thing that has already been stated so well?
All right, awesome. So I appreciate your presence on here tonight. Can you talk a little bit about each of you, your journey, either as somebody who identifies as neurodivergent or who has a special interest in neurodivergence, and in particular, what that has meant for you as a preacher? Lamar, can we start with you?
Sure. I'll try to keep this brief. As you mentioned in my introduction, most people have come to know me online as an autism pastor, and I always have to clarify that that's not a designation that I gave myself. It actually came from the short end of the story is it came from a mother who years ago, and I have no idea where she is now, who messaged me and told me I was like the pastor for the autism community because many of them did not feel welcome. And so, before Zoom was a thing, I used to Skype with families and talk with them and pray with them. And a lot of that was helpful for me in processing my own diagnosis. So I was late diagnosed autistic. I was diagnosed when I was 36. That was back in 2014. Um, and so that sort of gave a definitive label and definitive, I wouldn't say starting point, because I've always been autistic, but it gave me something to begin to work with. I share with people that around 7 or 8 years old, I knew there were significant differences between me and my peers because I didn't understand a lot of things. I faked a lot of things. And as it's commonly said, at a certain point, at certain points throughout my journey, the social demand started to exceed my capacity to mask. And that finally happened in the transition of me becoming the pastor of my former church. And I ran into what I call the proverbial wall. And I went to do some counseling. But by that time, I had already done my own homework and done some assessments online. And I was pretty sure, based on my lived experience and what these assessments were telling me, that I was autistic. And so by the time I did go and seek out a professional, I wasn't necessarily going for a diagnosis. I was going for someone to help me sort of sort through things. But when she did come back with that diagnosis, it did not surprise me because I had always felt like the world was in on an inside joke that I didn't get. And that just kind of, after transitioning into the pastorate, it just kind of confirmed that I wanted to get some definitions to what I had always been challenged with. And so that sort of helped me from there to work through some things and to find some ways to become authentically myself and to be successful at being a part of the clergy.
And Lamar, if you could tell us a little bit about what that has meant for your life as someone who preaches regularly.
As far as that journey and the diagnosis, I think it freed me up to. I tell people that people look at me and they say, "Oh, you've been very successful," and I tell them I've had a rough success. There are many places that I wouldn't say I was bounced out of as a clergy and a preacher because I didn't fit in, but you definitely know that the social demands are not going to be something that the social demands were so unrelenting that it became a place that I wasn't unsafe. So for me as a preacher, it gave me, I want to say, the internal permission to find ways to be authentically myself, which included all the different ways that I saw the biblical text differently from people and communicated it differently just because of my neurodivergent brain didn't always see things the same way. And so it came out in my preaching, but I didn't always feel like I had permission to pose those questions or to point out something that was a contradiction, which tended to happen a lot. And in church, those things sort of don't go over very well when you're trying to get somebody to ordain you. So you figure out that at least when you have something behind what makes your brain different, it at least gives you the fuel that you need internally to not quit when it was probably the design and the intent of a lot of different churches to make me quit. But I had some internal fuel as a pastor and a preacher to say, no, I know my brain works differently, and I think there's something there that God could use, and I'm going to try to find ways to allow my preaching to be an example of that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Avery, same question for you.
Yeah. Lamar, I resonated with a lot of what you were just saying, especially about that that churches really seem to be designed to push us out, even when people aren't actively saying get out. That it's hard. It's really hard. But to sort of rewind to like younger than that, I think being autistic shapes all of my ministry. When I was a little kid up through the present day, my main special interest, which for anyone watching who doesn't know, a special interest is a subject that an autistic person fixates on, usually to the extent that we're using it as like a lens through which we view the world, and we might use talking about it to communicate. But my main special interest has always been the Bible and theology, which meant that even as I got older, eventually realized I was queer, had a lot of reasons to leave Christianity. Being autistic and having that be my special interest sort of, in a way, kept me stuck there. And overall, I'm really grateful for that, because there's a lot of work to be done within Christianity, and I'm glad to be part of it. But yeah, I discerned a call to ministry while I was in undergrad, about the same time that I was figuring out that I was autistic. I also wasn't diagnosed as a kid, and I'm actually not diagnosed at all, which I think is important to name, that a lot of folks who are neurodivergent don't have the official diagnosis for a huge number of reasons. For one thing, like if you're not white, middle class, cis and straight, it's a lot harder to get the diagnosis. The access is difficult. So for me, it was just a matter of I have the academic autism, so I could get through school fine. So no one had any reason, to worry about me, and therefore I just didn't get diagnosed. And I chose not to get diagnosed for a lot of reasons. It can be really dangerous to be diagnosed if, say, you want to immigrate to another country. But anyway, when it was just a weird time to realize, oh, I want to go to seminary, and also I'm autistic. And as far as I can see, I heard several things that just came up organically, where different people in faith positions mentioned the idea that autistic people can't be pastors. It felt so random that it was coming up when I hadn't told them that I was autistic, but it happened twice while I was in the process of applying to seminaries. And so that made me really nervous, and I decided not to put being autistic on my application, which I think just having to make that decision really sucks, to say I might have to hide this part of myself while going into a career path that is about being vulnerable with people and the relationship aspect. I ended up deciding when I got to seminary, I think I lasted like a few weeks before I was like, I can't be quiet about this. It comes up too often that too much of what I want to do with my ministry is about disability theology, for one thing, is about being a pastor to people who are marginalized, and that includes autistic people. So I got more open about it, and I was so thankful I did, because I mean, it made me feel better to be authentic and all that. But also quite a few classmates and professors would open up to me about how they were neurodivergent and their own stresses about being neurodivergent and being in this career path, the stigma and also the inaccessibility. A few even talked to me about having an autistic child and just wanting to know how to be a supportive parent, how to help their child learn to navigate a world that's not built for them. But yeah, so I, during seminary, was on the ordination process, which sort of starts in my denomination and probably a lot as you're an inquirer, and then you pass eventually into candidate, which is the last stage. I got through all of that without very many problems, which might surprise some people because I'm openly trans in the South, but my presbytery was actually really cool about things. But as an autistic person, all the different hoops you have to get through are so difficult. Like bureaucracy type things just make my brain break down. But I got through all of the things except the last thing to get ordained I needed was to receive a call to be, usually most commonly that's either becoming a chaplain or getting a job as a pastor, right? That a church calls you to be their pastor. And I had realized by the time I graduated seminary that being a typical pastor of a typical church wasn't a path that I could do. Like, just for how I experienced being autistic, it's just not something I would be able to do in a way that would be healthy for myself and for a congregation. And so instead, I've been doing much more sort of unorthodox ministry, mostly online. Which means I can't get ordained because it's been tricky to sort of word what I do as ordainable. And over the years, I decided I didn't really want to be ordained anyway. Just disillusionment with the church in general a bit. I like to work. I like having this in between space where I'm not tied to any to like official church where I need to mind what I say because it impacts my livelihood or something like that. And I think that definitely impacts how I preach in that I get fewer preaching gigs. I don't really want to say that, but a lot of people don't really trust that an autistic person could come and preach to their community, and being on trans on top of that, like that's probably honestly the bigger one. But it definitely also, like, the way I preach tends to lean towards the prophetic versus the pastoral. Of course, I do a mix of both, but I think being in the position I am lends myself to being able to call out injustices, which I'm glad about, because for a lot of autistic people, it's hard to play by the social rules where you let certain things kind of be unspoken. So yeah, that's been some of my journey.
Thank you to both you and Lamar. I appreciate hearing in your words and in your own narration of your story the barriers that you face and the stigma that you face, but also the permissions that you found and the pathways to authenticity and the pathways toward pastoral expression and identity. So thank you for that. Aaron, what about you? How do you answer this question?
Well, I just want to say I have had the blessing of like sitting under Lamar's preaching, and then I've had the blessing of reading Avery's writing, and both are so prophetic. So I just want to, I'm really thankful for the risks that they take and the prophetic voices that they bring. I myself am also disabled. I have a medical disability, so it's a little different. But I think it's important for those of us who are disabled, and it's taken me a while to name that. And then, but my connection with studying neurodiversity and learning from neurodivergent people, there's just a couple things I wanted to mention. I mean, one was I had the honor of helping to put together an online course called Cultivating God's Brain Forest that is still available through the Institute for Youth Ministry. Lamar was a contributor to that curriculum. And what that curriculum is trying to do is to equip youth ministers that are pastoring with neurodivergent youth, how to do that well. And I would say, and actually there's tons of connections to congregational ministry. There's tons of resources as well for preaching in there. So it's not just for youth ministers, but the way that happened is we saw a need in our churches to equip those youth ministers. And we also saw a lot of pain. So kind of going back to some of the themes that I heard in Lamar and Avery's comments, when we gather a group of youth ministers and parents and neurodivergent youth to start listening, because this is youth voices are in this, practitioners, pastors, and it's, you know, primarily neurodivergent folks. We heard a lot of hurt around parents saying like our kids don't fit in the church, and youth saying like we're really struggling, kind of as Avery, I know you shared, to be a part of this space. So it was just really important for us to like bear witness to that. So that curriculum also does that, right? So it also equips. And then during COVID, I got to be part of like one of the coolest research projects ever, where I partnered with the Center for Theological Inquiry, and we worked with congregations, with neurodivergent folks in their congregations, to develop a Minecraft game that pastors and neurodivergent folks in the congregation, or anyone in the congregation, could play together to foster fellowship. And it was incredible. And I will say that out of everything in COVID, like that community ministered to me like no other. And so I think when it comes to preaching, like the walls are not wide enough, right? You know, our ideas are too limited, because I would see spontaneous like worship erupting in this video game. And I would see the leadership of neurodivergent folks being amplified in this particular space. And so I think the question becomes like, how can we learn from those spaces where neurodivergent folks' leadership is already amplified and showcased, right? And trusted and valued and empowered, right? And do that better in our communities.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think that's where the term that Avery used around neuronormativity is really important, right? To think about the ways that perhaps traditional preaching practices and expectations provide a norm that's only a norm for some people, right? That only carves a path for some people and not everyone. So I appreciate the way that experience around the Minecraft game and your other experiences paint a wider picture of what preaching and proclamation might be, to be more inclusive and more diverse, so that it can serve all of God's family. So I really appreciate that. We're beginning to turn there in some respects. And so I wonder, our next question is, what might it look like to engage in biblical interpretation for preaching with attention to neurodivergence? So Lamar, you had started to indicate a little pathway there. And I'm wondering if we might start with you on that question.
Yeah, it's a tough question for someone who identify more as a theologian than a biblical scholar. But I will say this. One of the things, and I was recently sharing this with some parents who had contacted me to say, how do I, teach the Bible to my neurodivergent or autistic child or grandchild who thinks very literally. And I said, I think the first step is to tell the truth about what the Bible actually is and what it isn't. And in doing that, tell them that there are parts, large parts of the biblical text that are not meant to be taken literally. And I think, until we kind of start there, especially with minds that tend to think very literally, we don't give permission for other ways to read the Bible. So I would say that. And then piggybacking off of that is to also then give permission to view the Bible as a literary work, which then opens up a wealth of conversation and abilities to approach the text that pays specific attention to neurodivergence in the ways that sometimes, I don't want to overgeneralize, but, for the sake of this conversation, there are some generalizations when it comes to neurodiverse minds. But giving permission to read it as a literary work, to study it as a literary work, and then to open up the vast amount of different approaches and different conversations that can be had, which would pay more attention to neurodivergence. Um, I think that's where I would start. I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues, but I think that's where I would start because I know it was extremely helpful for me, even though I was already, um, in ministry, pastoring at some capacity, albeit not maybe a senior pastor. I was moving into a senior pastor role. But it was hugely freeing and liberating for me going through seminary, being taught, you don't have to read that literally. It can be read more as a literary work. And then from there, you can apply all the different rules to reading literary works that opens up more of a conversation that tends to foster more inclusion for those who are neurodivergent. And so I would start there is just say, tell the truth about what the Bible actually is and what it isn't.
Yeah, and don't assume that everybody else uses the same sort of frame of reference as you, is what I hear you saying. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Aaron, can we come to you? And then Avery, if you'll answer.
Sure. I think, one of the things, is so like, I feel like I get this question a lot, but kind of more in a general disability sense, like, people who are not disabled will kind of be like, well, if I'm not disabled, like, how do I preach well, right? About the passages about disability or with disability in mind. And, my invitation to them usually is preach your own ableism. Like, see the speck in your own eye, right? And use that as an opportunity to humble yourself, right, as the preacher, and to teach your congregation about something that they may not have thought about. I think that is so instructive, right, for people to hear about what you have learned, often out of your own, right, ignorance and ableism. And I think Avery brought up ableism earlier, and ableism is not to say anybody is doing anything purposefully harmful or discriminatory, but simply kind of this term like neuronormative, right? It's the idea that like our society is not constructed with disabled people in mind. It's not set up for disabled people to survive, let alone thrive. And so the more that we can recognize that, the safer, right, we can make the space for everybody. So that's one invitation in preaching kind of in general. And then where that leads you, I think, is incredible, right? Like I was talking about really expanding what we think of maybe as preaching. And then here we get into opportunities to move beyond just speaking and text-based preaching. And I just always think about this because I'm a professor and I teach in classrooms, and it's, we know that this doesn't work, right? Like standing up, and I mean, and I know that you do better than this in your own preaching, but standing up, right, and lecturing and talking for a long time is a very difficult way for most people to learn. I think what Avery shared about like, there really is no neurotypical, right? Like that probably fits most of us. So then this invites us to engage the senses, to engage dialogue, to do things differently. And when I was in pastoral ministry, this is something that we try to do on a regular basis to create a different form of engagement in the preaching movement. We did it once a month, and we called it this interactive inclusive service. And when we got to the preaching moment, the story was shared in a very interactive way. The children like told the story of scripture, and then the preaching engagement was there were stations, and you could go and you can engage, in different ways. And so then it became, and so this idea too of choices, right? So we think about in a preaching moment, if like the only person who makes choices is the preacher, that doesn't open up a lot of pathways to learning. So to the extent to which you can create those opportunities, right, for people to engage in ways that work best for them. And I'm sure Avery, I want to stop here because I'm sure Avery also has some fabulous things to add.
That's great, Avery. Let's take your cue.
I love those creative ideas for preaching, and sometimes preaching is called it's part of the proclamation of the word. That doesn't have to look like your traditional one person standing behind a pulpit reading a thing or, speaking for 20 minutes. It can absolutely be more interactive and fun. But I really liked your suggestion that folks can kind of call out their own ableism as one thing to do. And I think the Bible is good for that, in that I think it's like we can acknowledge that there is ableism throughout the Bible. Obviously, terms like even the term like the concept of disability was completely different back then, but looking at it from a modern lens, like the fact that Jesus heals most of the people named as being blind or being unable to walk, the fact that he cures them is really difficult to reckon with, especially when we're holding to a sort of framework like neurodiversity, that disability isn't a thing that needs to be cured away, that it's not a brokenness. And I think the way to engage that in your preaching is to wrestle with that, to wrestle with what does it mean that we have all these healing stories and that those miracles are pretty central to Jesus's ministry, and how do we get creative in finding figures in the Bible that are disabled that don't get healed. So realizing as one of the most foundational sort of ideas in disability theology that Jesus is disabled on the cross, that he rises with disabling wounds. That's one way to say he chose to rise with these wounds that would have been disabling. So how can you say that disability is incompatible with divinity when it's right there? It's in the risen body. But and also like Zacchaeus, who might have been a little person. And you can even, so those are sort of places where you can really, there's more solid things in the text, but you can also get more imaginative than that, right? You can employ imagination and curiosity and kind of have fun with it. What if Jesus is autistic? What if Peter has ADHD? He is so impulsive. And yeah, just paying attention for the people who seem to be acting in ways that aren't very neurotypical. I really like to look at the story of David dancing before the ark, dancing naked, and his wife is so ashamed of him. What are you doing? The servants are seeing you and laughing, like you're becoming a laughing stock. And him sort of saying, this is how I worship God. I'm doing this dance, this movement that is a way of worshiping God, and I don't care what other people think when they see me. I think just, yeah, having fun and looking for those places and being imaginative. Honestly, God, looking like when it comes to the very theological aspects, God is not neurotypical, right? God does not follow human norms and our modern society's norms of what it means to be neurotypical. God says it themselves, right? In 1 Samuel, I forget which chapter, but the idea that God says, like, I don't look at people the way you look at people, the way humans see, where you're looking at someone's face and I'm looking at their heart. That God flat out says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. God sort of is established throughout Scripture as the ultimate stranger in the way that God is so different from humans, even while constantly putting in the effort to form relationships with humans, which, like, I'm not saying God has to be read as autistic, but that sure resonates with me as an autistic person. These efforts to communicate and often being the only side that is making the effort is pretty relatable. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it for now.
Yeah, that's great. I love how you're calling us to be curious about the text. And I think what you're opening a path toward for us is saying, even in the questions that you were taught to ask, maybe in seminary or your theological education, whatever that looked like, expand them, right? Get even more curious and imaginative with the text. Take a risk. Be even more daring with the questions that you ask. And I love that as a practice. Thank you. So our next two questions are kind of about preachers, and they're about listeners. So I'll start with the question about preachers, because my suspicion is, and my hope is that in advertising this conversation, we've gathered those in this online space who perhaps identify as neurodivergent, and hopefully came with an expectation that they would find community, right, and a word for them. So let's start with those who identify as neurodivergent preachers. What would you want those who identify as neurodivergent preachers to hear about their identities as preachers and about their preaching practices? So what would you want colleagues who preach and who experience and express themselves as neurodivergent, what would you want them to hear about themselves and their identities and their practices? Erin, can we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be very brief. We need you. I mean, I just, like Avery, it took like all my self-control to not unmute and yell amen, with everything that you were just sharing. And I'm so blessed to be in spaces with folks who are willing to share their neurodivergent experience and also bringing these interpretations to the text. So what I also want to say is I'm sorry, because I also think the church, we need to lament the ways that we have made folks feel excluded. And I can't say that enough, right? Because there is, because that hurt runs so deep, I know that. So the thing is, like, anytime I hear someone in the church who is willing to share their experience of being neurodivergent and is preaching, I am praising God for their bravery and their, stick-to-itness. Lamar described something that kind of kept him going, because that is I'm sure that, like, it's a daily battle, right? Because there's lots of microaggressions society isn't set up. There's all these things. So those are the two things that I would want people to hear is, I'm sorry that the church has not appreciated your gifts. Thank you. We need you. And I guess the other piece is, like, we need to do better. But that's what I'll say.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate that. Lamar, how about you?
I would say this, well, a couple of things. I coined a phrase a while back, years ago, and it was kind of to help myself, but it says, if you're going to blaze a trail, you can't fear fire. And so, I've since amended that. It said you can be afraid of fire, but do it anyway. Just because of what Erin is saying, like this, and Avery may have said this to you, but there's so few of us that, at a certain point, years ago when I first started this, I'm not saying I'm the only one, but I definitely felt very lonely as a Black autistic clergy, and blazing that trail, realizing that I'm going to get burnt sometimes, either through my own mistakes of not trusting myself or through other people's ignorance. But the goal was always to leave a trail behind me that made it easier for other neurodivergent pastors, preachers to sort of traverse that path. So that would be the first thing I would say, that all of us are sort of called to that, even in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets, right? There was, and that leads into my second comment, there is this tradition. I had a great time when I did the clergy scholar program at Yale, unfortunately, and my group was the inaugural and the last class, because it was only a one-year program that only lasted 1 year before they got rid of it, but I had a chance to study it, and I cannot remember the professor's name. Willie Jennings was one of them, but there was another professor who was an Old Testament professor, and we learned a lot about the prophets. And I remember saying to him, you know, a lot of these characteristics they were talking about, these prophets sound autistic. They sound neurodivergent. Like they're part of the community, but they're really not. Like they enjoy being out in the wilderness by themselves, but they have enough connection and relationships with people, so they care enough about people, but they also have this thing where they're not wired to care so much about what people think that they don't say what needs to be said. And that's sort of a fine line that you see a lot of the Old Testament prophets walk. And he said, you know, that it's probably true. And he said, you know, as we had a conversation, I said, do you think it's possible that maybe those were the reason why they all had the same characteristics is because God chose people with those characteristics because he knew they're sort of the perfect people to speak prophetically because they care enough about people, but not so much that it um, tends to knock them off course of being able to be a prophetic witness. And so that's my second point is that I think what I would want them to know about their identities is that we live in the tradition of the prophetic witness of the Old Testament prophets. And I think it's okay to live that. I think I became a much better preacher, much freer preacher when I accepted that because I was willing to say things that other people were not willing to say because I didn't have such an emotional attachment to what people thought about me that it, you know, scared me away from saying. And the reason why, and I'll finish with this, the reason why I began to understand that was a part of how I was operating is because people would often come up to me and say, oh, that was so brave, or that was so courageous what you did or what you said. And I'm thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? I just said what I felt like God. So it wasn't until afterwards that I knew that, oh, that probably was something that could have got me fired, or that probably was something that could have taken away my livelihood. But in the moment, I didn't understand that or allow that to stop me from saying what needed to be said. And so I would just say if that's a part of your identity as you identify as neurodivergent, to lean into that because I do think God may choose those of us who have those characteristics for that particular reason, because there is a certain level of naivety that, oh, maybe that is something that could get me in trouble, but I didn't realize it until people started telling me that could have got you in trouble. And so I've leaned into that, and it's made me a much better preacher, even a much better pastor, to be honest with you. And I think that it comes natural to most of us who are neurodivergent. So don't be afraid of that. Lean into that. That's a part of your identity. That's a part of how God wired you. And he selected and called you because he wants all of how he wired you to come across in the preaching moment.
That's really beautifully said. And I love that narrative analogy. So thank you for that gift, Lamar. Avery, what do you think about this question?
Now it's my turn to say, I was also, as Lamar spoke, just amen to all of that. Absolutely. And like Aaron said, that to any neurodivergent preachers out there, or those who hope to be preachers, we need you. Like, the church desperately needs you. It desperately needs all kinds of marginalized voices, in part because marginalized people are the ones most likely to notice that the system as it is not working. And a lot of neurodivergent folks are the ones who are most likely to say something about it, to take that risk. And the church needs that. Or it continues to perpetuate all the evils, which, is not the point of church. I also in a literal way, your voice is vital. If you're worried about a preacher because the literal way you speak is through signing or AAC, or you have tics or a speech difference, a stutter, you can still be a preacher. If you feel called to preach, and you don't need to change intrinsically in order to do that. I won't pretend like you'll get a lot of gigs. It will probably be really hard at certain points to find places that want you to preach, but you will find them. And sometimes they're in non-traditional places like online. I know some people have podcasts that are essentially them preaching. or I'm part of a community called The Word in Black and Red, which is a podcast, but it's also a Discord community. And every Sunday somebody preaches. You could, like, anyone can sign up. I think the main person does a slate vetting process to make sure that you're going to be preaching, not horrible things. But that's a great way to preach, either as practice for more traditional preaching or as an alternative too, because you deserve to be heard in whatever way you speak. And then less literally, your voice is vital. But I think about Moses and the story in Exodus 3 and 4 as well, where Moses keeps asking God, like, why are you choosing me to be your voice? I have a speech impairment. I am heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. And that language heavily implies that it is some sort of speech difference, even though we, trying to guess at what exactly doesn't work very well. And God's response is to say, to keep saying, I choose you. It has to be you. In part, I believe, because of Moses's weird in-between space as this bicultural person. And God offers the accommodation of Aaron, that Moses has a spokesperson who can speak for him and with him. You deserve that help, that the accommodations like that too. So figure out what you need and don't stop bothering people till you get it, because you deserve it and you're needed.
Thank you, Avery. We're beginning to run short on our time. So if we can, in the next question, to try to be somewhat brief, but also I'm going to invite anybody who's hanging out with us online. If you have a question you want to submit, we might have a little time when we can get to it. But what would you want preachers to consider as they think about neurodivergent listeners? So now we're sort of flipping the script. We've thought about neurodivergent preachers, but what do we want preachers to consider about neurodivergent listeners? Aaron, you've started on that just a little bit ago. Would you mind maybe adding something to that, and then we can kind of lightning round it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, I feel like Lamar taught me this just as much as anybody, but that, attention may look different depending on, the person's neurodivergence. And so I actually think that we can do a lot more education in our congregations to make sure that when neurodivergent folks are engaging with worship, but of course we're talking about the preaching moment, that people aren't trying to shut them down or trying to discipline them, because, for instance, like, Avery mentioned ticking, but there's also stimming, and so excitement, and it's interesting because this is also, like, obviously just very different culturally in different congregations in terms of kind of what goes as attention. But I think that that's something where we really need to be cognizant that what look like attention for one person might not look like attention for another person. And I just wanted to share that both Avery and Lamar are involved in a new book project, and we have a book coming out called Cripping Youth Ministry with Erdman's, hopefully next spring. And in that book, a lot of folks who are neurodivergent are talking about their experiences of trying to engage in worship, for instance, by like having their phone out, right? And taking notes, or even playing a game on the phone, but listening at the same time, right? And we have all these assumptions about who's paying attention and not, and having people kind of get in their face and tell them that they should be doing something else in worship, right? When it might be their way of engaging. It's something that we really have to work on as church, because we're not out there to kind of police people's attention, right? So yeah, I think, and I think then we can grow as we ask people, like, oh, tell me about that game you were playing on your phone, right? I mean, couldn't we do that rather than just assuming? So anyway, I'll jump off here.
That's great. Thank you for that. Avery, can we come to you, and then we'll end with Lamar?
Yeah. One thing is, if you're listening and thinking, well, I don't have a neurodivergent audience. Yeah, you do. Whether people identify as or are open about identifying as neurodivergent, or they don't know, there's always going to be neurodiversity in any group of people. So even if you don't think you are preaching to such people, you are. So sort of, instead of having one method for preaching to those people that's different than your normal way, universalize it. And that includes things like Aaron said. That includes sort of being mindful about what language you're using, and avoiding ableist language, which includes things like saying stupid or idiot. I don't know that you'd say idiot in a sermon, but I've definitely heard stupid. The main thing I want to say is, because I've heard it in too many sermons, do not use inspiration porn. If you're not sure what that is, I highly recommend you look up inspiration porn. But basically, it's a story that uses a disabled person as an object lesson for abled people. If you have a story about a disabled person in your sermon, think really hard. Is it designed to make people feel really good and go, ah? Or also, on the other hand, is it designed to make people go to be like, wow, that disabled person did it, so what's my excuse? It's probably not good, and you shouldn't be using that in your sermon. It's very hurtful, and it just creates this narrative around disabled people, about being an object lesson. And yeah, so be cautious and mindful.
Super helpful advice, and very practical. So thanks for that, Avery. Lamar?
Oh, sorry. I would just quickly piggyback off of what's already been said, and I would I put this language to it. It is to lean into the theological disruption that is neurodivergent listeners. And I use disruption in a good way. Because when you have to consider that you have neurodivergent listeners, and even just disabled people as a whole, it makes you have to consider the ways that we need to disrupt our current theology that privileges things like certain quote unquote levels of cognitive ability, or all the different ways in which we've privileged ways of knowing that are not necessarily inviting, and in some senses harmful to neurodivergent listeners. So from a practical standpoint, I would say, as I piggyback off of Aaron and Avery, is to find you some neurodivergent listeners in your congregation and form a relationship with them, and talk about texts that you plan to preach, and how do they hear it? What are their, and I say hear not as a physical, I guess I should say, how do they receive it? Because I don't want to be ableist in my language. I call myself there. But how do they receive that text? What does it mean to them? What are the different ways that they experience it, in ways that will help you with your preaching? And, You know, what's funny is I actually started doing that years ago before I even knew I was autistic, because I had people in my congregation who were saying, you know, when you preached on Mother's Day is not a good day for everyone. And some of us are struggling. Some of us are, you know, have this experience. Some of us have that experience. And for the first time as a young preacher, I realized everybody's not experiencing the text the same way. And it was good for me to just discuss that with people who would help me to find some balance, and some integrity, and to lessen the amount of harm that I was potentially doing by not including people, um, as I went to the sacred desk to study. So I would encourage people to even do that, is to find you a group of people who are neurodivergent and ask them to help you.
That is a fantastic recommendation. So thank you for that. We've got one question in the chat that I want to try to answer really quickly because I know we're running short on time, but it asks, are there other methods or models you have found to be life-giving for neurodivergent worshipers? I just want to offer one quick resource. There's a book by Dave Sinos, C-S-I-N-O-S, and it's called A Church for All Ages. It doesn't address neurodivergence in particular, but it does address intergenerational worship. And I think with an additional lens on top of that, the ideas that Dave explores in that book can be really helpful for expanding what preaching might look like with neurodivergent worshipers in mind. So thanks for the question. And thanks to you all, guests tonight, Avery, Aaron, Lamar, thank you so much for your time, your energy, the thoughtfulness you've put into this conversation. I really appreciate the time you spent with us tonight, so thank you. Friends, our next web conversation will take place on Tuesday, November the 3rd. We will be talking about preaching or preaching as conversation. We've got a wonderful slate of guests lined up to talk about that. If you want to find out more about the Bridge, you can run to our website, upsim.edu/bridge, and you can learn more about our cohort program. Our applications for that open up on October 1st. It's coming quickly. You can sign up for our email list. You can make a donation for our further work. Find us on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for the Bridge for Early Career Preachers. And we are funded by a generous grant from the Lilly Endowment's Compelling Preaching Initiative. You can find out more about that initiative and other grant programs like ours at compellingpreaching.org. Thank you again to our fabulous panel for the insight and wisdom and the depth and richness with which they've engaged tonight. And thanks to you all who've joined us online. We appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Have a great rest of your night.